the ministry of Liz Henschel and celebrating the fact that she's moving into retirement. Liz has been a missionary with WEC for 40 years, and our church has been supporting Liz for those 40 years. So it's a great occasion for our church in Liz next Sunday. And the preacher next Sunday will be Brian Stewart. And some of you will have very fond memories of Brian's ministry in Dubbo Baptist Church, which was 20 years. He could only last half as long as Liz. But Brian has had an amazing ministry to this church. And all of us here today have a great debt of gratitude to Brian. So next Sunday, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be great. So make sure you're here next Sunday. But if I can bring you back to today. Today we're focusing on, I guess it's a step back in time as well. We're thinking of the 40 Days of Purpose, which stemmed from Rick Warren's book, A Purpose-Driven Life. I think it was celebrated in this church in 2006. But the last thing I wanted to do before I left was remind you of this teaching and prompt you to live life purposefully. So we begin by thinking of two passages that Rick Warren identified to give his 5 purposes. The first one is Matthew 22 and verse 36. Often it's spoken of as the Great Commandment. Someone came to Jesus. Teacher, they said, which is the greatest commandment in all the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. And all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. The second verse, our passage, is what we often refer to as the Great Commission. And it's found in Matthew 28 and verse 19. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. And I reckon, Liz, this is probably a passage that you personally or somebody else kind of thrust under your attention to set your life goals up. Thanks for nodding, because it's going to be very embarrassing. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. And Rick Warren distilled these 2 passages into 5 purposes. The first is to worship God, that is to love Him with your whole heart, with your whole soul, and with your whole mind. The second purpose is fellowship, that is caring for our brothers and sisters, loving our neighbour as ourselves. The third is discipleship, teaching and obeying, teaching people to obey all that Jesus has commanded. The fourth is demonstrating our love to others and loving our neighbour through serving a needy world. And the fifth is, did I put the wrong word there? No? Did I skip evangelism? I think I did. Evangelism is likewise helping people to understand Jesus. And today we're going to look at that first purpose, which is to worship God. But firstly, I wanted you to look at this cartoon. My grandson, eldest grandson, was quite fanatically into this movie, and it says, I couldn't fix your brakes, so I made your horn louder. It kind of sounds an odd approach, but yet it's something that we, as human beings, we often do this, don't we? We have a legitimate problem, but we find a solution that doesn't address the problem and actually is kind of an illegitimate solution to our problem. And you think in so many ways, so many of the casualties that we see in society are people who have had a legitimate problem, but they've tried to address that in an illegitimate way, and they've ended up crashing. Worship is kind of bringing us back to look at ourselves and consider what the real problem is. Because the real problem is our human heart. And when we come back to examine ourselves as we think about God and worship God, we're actually able to make the adjustments in the right places to deal with the problem. Many years ago, in the mid-80s, I was pastor in Broken Hill, and I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to have a Christian radio program every Sunday night after church. I'd go on the radio. And there's a couple of things that you'll find surprising. Firstly, the radio station had an automated system, and Broken Hill was actually the first place in Australia to get and operate this automated system, which is surprising. The second thing I'm sure you'll be surprised at is the way the system operated. There was a computer. Remember, in the 80s, computers were quite what they are today, but there was a computer. And this computer turned off and on 18 different cassette players. And it would be able to find a song, it would be able to find on a different cassette the place where the announcer said what the song was. It would find on a different cassette the announcer saying what the time was. It would search through backwards and forwards in all these cassettes and play them. And that kind of sounds pretty primitive, because I guess it is. Well, often what would happen, all this activity of searching through these cassette players and getting everything lined up the right way, this computer would just it'd just say, this is too much. And it would just freeze up and do nothing. So what you have to do is reset the time on the computer. And when you reset the time, away it went, it just worked perfectly, as if nothing had ever happened. And I reckon that worship is a little bit like that. When we come to worship God, we reset, we recalibrate our heart and our view of the world. You know, we often can kind of get overloaded by the world. We can be overloaded with different ideas or different priorities. We can be overloaded with the stresses and anxieties that life gives us. We can get kind of our mind and our thinking, our priorities all out of whack. But when we come to consider God and consider who He is in the context of worship, it resets our focus, it resets our priorities, and it helps us to understand what life is really about. In Psalm 116, the worshipper's key question is, how can I repay the Lord for all His goodness to me? You see, this is, I think, the question that seems to arise from worship. Because when we can worship God, when we can understand who He is, we can leave our anxieties, we can leave our warped priorities at the door, and we can reset our heart and focus on God. And this was the problem that the psalmist faced in Psalm 73. The psalmist had a problem, and he was pretty sure that life was ripping him off. He says in verse 2, "But as for me, my feet almost slipped. I nearly lost my foothold, for I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." He saw bad people, but the bad people, the wicked people that he saw, they seemed to be prospering. Everything in life seemed to be going okay for them. And he says in verse 4, they have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They're free from common human burdens, and they're not plagued by human ills. You know, he's looking at their lives and he's saying they don't seem to have any financial problems. Their careers are flourishing. They're holidaying wherever they want. They live the good life. They're bad people, but they're leading a great life. And then in verse 9 or 6 he says, their pride is their necklace. Their mouths lay claim to heaven. Their tongues take possession of the earth. They're smug, they're arrogant, and they think they have life all figured out. And it looks like they do. Things are going their way. Every time they roll the dice, they seem to come up a winner. In verse 10, he says, therefore the people turn to them and listen to all their words. So not only are they on their own path doing real well, but they're getting other people sucked in to their worldview. Other people see them as role models because they have money, they have power, they have status. It's all going well for them. In verse 11, these people say, how can God know? Does the Most High have knowledge? And at this point, as the psalmist is saying all this, don't you kind of think maybe he's talking about Australia in 2023? Where people openly mock God, they choose all sorts of other pathways that exclude God or exclude God's wisdom. And they seem to be doing well, and they say that if you believe in God, well, you're a bit weird. They're not trying to obey God. They have this warped worldview, and it seems to be working for them. And I think that applies to you as well. And he says in verse 30, surely in vain I kept my heart pure. In vain I've washed my hands in innocence. I wonder if you've ever thought that. We've had so many public square debates recently about changes to legislation. And it seems to me that the Christian worldview has lost almost every one of those debates. The psalmist is saying, has it ever been in vain that you follow God? You see, it's bad enough for him that his opponents are doing well. But he's saying, what do I get? Oh, I've done the right thing. I paid my taxes. I didn't cheat on my taxes. I go to church. I read the Bible. I've done all the right things. And where does it seem to get me? They seem to prosper all the time. Do you ever feel like this? In verse 16 he says, when I tried to understand this, it was oppressive to me. I tried to figure it out. Why is life so unfair? I asked God, where are you in the midst of it all? And he seems like we try to work it out and we only get a headache and struggle with all these issues. But then comes verse 17. Verse 17 is a pivot, and everything changes on this pivot. In verse 17 he says, until I entered the sanctuary of God, and then I saw the whole picture. All those thoughts were true until he went into worship and saw God. He says, then I took my focus off myself and I put it on God. I took my focus off my desires and my agenda and my petty jealousies, my self-preoccupation. And when I took my focus off that and put it on God, I focused on Him. And I realised that the world was in His hands. And then I bowed and worshipped. Then he saw that although nothing had changed, everything had changed in his view of the world. He saw a new reality. He got sanity because he saw the world as it really is. And he says in verse 23, God, I'm always with you. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel. And afterward, whatever this life holds, for this brief moment, you will take me in glory. In verse 18, he says, I saw that human beings, apart from you, have been placed amongst the good ground. You see, he thought that he was on pretty tough ground, pretty rocky ground, pretty horrible ground, but now he realises that it's these other people who are denying God that are actually on the slippery ground. And during life, we need to be on some firm and stable ground, because life can be pretty slippery sometimes. One day, all of a sudden, you're out of a job. It happens to people every day. One day, the doctor tells you you have a major health problem. One day, somebody comes home to a nice house, but it's an empty house. One day, somebody fails to give way to you, and you thought you were bulletproof and discover that you're not. The psalmist says that before he understood, he was like a dumb beast. But after he worshipped God and put it all in perspective, suddenly he had a new beautiful world. Suddenly it all made sense. You see, worshipping God is to think about his might and his power, his creative genius. Worshipping is reflecting on God's character and recognising his righteousness and justice. Worship allows us to see God's love and mercy operating in our lives. These are all the words and the ideas that are in the songs that we sing. And as we come to worship, it changes our perspective, it changes our mind, and it recalibrates our heart. We worship God because God is worthy of being worshipped, not because we get something out of it. In fact, worship requires that we take our eyes off ourselves and put our eyes on God. We worship solely because God is worthy. See, selfishness is a barrier to worship. But we are self-centered by nature, and so we struggle to maintain this right position of worshiping God. Romans 8 and 7 says, focusing on yourself is the opposite of focusing on God. Anyone completely absorbed in self ignores God and ends up thinking more about self than God. This is the paradox. We were made to worship God, but when we do worship God, we get something out of the worship. I want to read you a quote from Rolf Croucher. He wrote this about worship. He said, worship is the appropriate response to God who gives everything life. To the Holy One who inhabits eternity, to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who is God our Saviour. We worship not because worship benefits us, although it does, not because we need to, although we do, not because it is relevant to our daily lives, although it is, but because God is. Worship is service. It's the same word in the New Testament. Serving the Lord in our praises, praising the Lord in our ministry to others, ministering to the Lord in prayerful solitude. It's all worship. Worship is both individual and corporate, done both in the secret place and in the redeemed community. For a devout Christian, worship is all of life and lifelong. So worshipping isn't something observed or attended, it is something we are and do. And as we are what we eat, so we are what we worship, and we become like the God we worship. Revelation 4 verse 12 says, you, God, created everything, and it is for your pleasure that we exist and were created. We were created to worship God and for his pleasure. And so our number one purpose here in this world is actually to worship God. Now, probably the best verse that defines worship, I think, is Romans 12 and verse 1. It says, because of God's great mercy to us, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice to God, dedicated to his service and pleasing to him. This is your true worship that you should offer. And there are four things I want to say in response to that verse. The first is that worship is my response to God's love. Worship is the way I respond to God when he loves me. And that's really what worship is. It is this response. Notice it says, because of God's great mercy. Oh, He loved us, He sent His Son to die for us, and our response to that is to offer ourselves to God. Secondly, worship is giving back to God. Worship is giving back to God because He first gave to us. And whenever you give back to God, whenever you offer Him anything, that's worship. And it brings pleasure to God. So when our children are grateful for whatever they receive from us, we like that. It's what we're aiming to do, and God is pleased when we express our gratefulness to Him. So whatever we give to God as our response to Him, whether it's here in a place of formal worship, or whether we're serving somebody else while we're doing that because of what God has done in our heart, it's all worship. It's all worship. The third point is worship is expressing affection to God. The Bible says we love Him because He first loved us. And He wants us to love Him back. Not to go through a motion of worship or a motion of religious life, but to actually love Him with all our hearts. Hosea 6, God is saying, I don't want your sacrifices. I want your love. I don't want your offerings. I want you to know me. Exodus 34, it says that God is passionate about His relationship with you. Passion is a word that has kind of taken on a life of its own in recent days. People are passionate about their jobs. They're passionate about their hobbies. We talk about all sorts of things. That's my passion. That's what I do. But we need to make sure that our heart is so filled with worship to God that we are actually passionate in our desire to know Him, to love Him, and express that to Him. Romans 6:13 says, give yourselves completely to God, since you have been given new life. Again, it's a response. It's a response of gratitude and affection to God. And the fourth thing that worship is, it's using my abilities for God. Colossians 3:23 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as though you were working for the Lord your God. Whatever you do. This means everything that we do every day. Work at it with all your heart, as though you were working for the Lord and not for people. This also points to the fact that everything we do is worship to God. Even some of the unpleasant things, even the boring things, whatever we do. Romans 12, in the Message, it expresses it this way. Take your everyday, ordinary life. You're sleeping, you're eating, you're going to work, you're walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. And that, I think, really sums up a worshipful approach to God. It means that we take everything that we do, every dumb and boring aspect of our ordinary lives, we offer them to God, that He might redeem and make something good and useful out of it. That our lives, offered to Him, might reflect well on Him and might bring a sense of praise and glory for what He's doing in us. Worship happens here. It recalibrates our heart, but it also happens in everything we do, the ordinary, routine, mundane things of life, and everything can be turned to an act of worship. It's a response to God. It's an offering of ourselves, and it comes through a change of heart so that we recognise God's great character, His great goodness, and His great will. Let's ensure that when our mind gets fuzzy, we press that button to recognise who God is, recalibrate our heart, and recalibrate the way that we do things so that we offer them to Him in worship. Would you pray? Father, so very often we make everything in life about ourselves and our comfort, our winning and our welfare. Pray, Father, that you would help us to change our minds so that we're able to make everything about you and your greatness and your goodness, and we're able to recognise your grace in our life and so praise you for it. I pray, Father, that you would help us to take the whole of our life and live it in such a way that it is a worthy offering to you. We seek to worship you. We seek to acknowledge you as the God who has given us life and redeemed us